to the Brain Scrub, a somewhat improvised approach to mental health. My name is Glenn Sollers. Thank you for tuning into this episode, which is my first video recorded episode after almost 90 podcasts. And I figure this one, with the content I'm about to share with you, it's important that you see me as a human being, my nonverbal cues, to make some connection because I'm going to talk about parental alienation and I want to share my story. There's so many people out there sharing their stories, and I figured it's about time I share mine because change will only happen if we can share stories about what's going on. There's been tons of media attention on many different things, such as sexual abuse, child abuse, you name it. Things are coming to the surface, and it's done through storytelling. And I want to share my story today. My son is almost 21 years old, and I think he can handle this now. And it's probably at an age where it's about time he might want to hear from what I went through. And this is all about my experience of parental alienation as a targeted parent. And my intention for you today is just to understand what us targeted parents go through and my journey. It's been over 7 years since I've seen my son and how I've dealt with it, what I've realized. And I've been to many different podcasts trying to identify what's going on, understand what I should or should not be doing. And I made a lot of mistakes in terms of what I shouldn't have done to try to see my son. It's too late now. I did what I did, but I don't want other parents to go through the same thing. Like, ideally, when somebody gets a divorce, and they have children, they should be forced to take some sort of parenting program that includes alienation as part of this because it is rising. The trend is rising. There are certain stats out there that I want to share with you, and that is in 30% of families in Canada and the US feel that alienation by a child has happened. The National Institute of Health states that 11 to 15% of families in the United States and Canada have alienated children and a targeted parent. So what happens in alienation is there's one parent that would be the alienator and they're like the abuser. And this is defined by many different organizations that it is child abuse, it's mental abuse because the child is being manipulated and coerced to feel the other parent is to be rejected. And of course, there's many cases where this is justified, where maybe there was some sort of abuse that happened, but there's legitimate abuse and then there is made up abuse. And alienation, clearly in my case, was a lot of made up abuse. What I did was not abusive whatsoever. It was just me being a caring parent, doing the best job that I thought I could. But when things go back and truths are manipulated, it is difficult to fight this situation. 6 to 7% of alienated parents commit suicide. It is a hard thing to go through. I can't even explain how difficult this time's been for me. I've had to go to therapists. I've had to deal with my anxieties. Now it helped me understand how to be a better parent. We all have room for improvement. I've done a lot of self-awareness work, and this is great in that respect because I learned so much about myself and what should I do, and hence this podcast, hey? Like, I'm trying to tell the world, you want to love, you want to build community, you want to see how you show up in this world and be the best version of you. I've learned a lot about that as this time went on. Now, there are many advocates out there that I just want to say thank you to. And I'm not going to list all the names. Maddie is probably the most recent one, and she's an alienated child, and she has a lot of incredible podcasts that help build my awareness of what a child goes through. Ryan Thomas kind of got me on this like 8 years ago, 7 years ago, when I approached the court system in my country of Canada. I did mention parental alienation, and it was, in my point of view, discounted, not even addressed. And I made it clear in black and white with evidence that this is going on. Amy Baker, huge success story in parental alienation's done a lot for the community. And there are so many others advocating trying to change the system because the system is broken. Kids are being abused, and it's not just the kid that is being abused or the kids, it is the extended family. Essentially, somebody is saying, you are no good, and the other parent is all good. So I have a bunch of notes around here, and I want to start off by just sharing a bit about an article, and this is from the National Institute of Health. Okay. And I'm going to just quote them in this article. No matter what you think of the other party, these children are one half of each of you. Remember that because every time you tell your child what an idiot his father is or what a fool his mother is, you're telling the child half of him is bad. Now, sadly, and there's no right or wrong, but it is what it is. More men are targeted than women. Just want to throw it out there. So when you hear about this, what I see is I see a lot of women advocating out there. And yeah, there are some men, and I wish there were more. We need to share this story because I've tried to share my story with the Ministry of the Attorney General, the Prime Minister of Canada, the Justice Counselors of BC. Nobody seems to be willing to listen, and they're just saying it's too complex. Nothing can be done. But there is so many negative impacts of this, especially on the child eventually, because they're learning habits such as push the problem away, don't deal with that person. They're all bad. Part of you is all bad. I'm going to continue with the article. Parental alienation has been defined by some as a serious mental condition in children exposed to parental alienating behaviors. Parental alienation can be identified through the presence of five factors. The child refuses, sorry, this is factor number one. The child refuses, opposes, or avoids relationship with a parent. Yes, that happened with me. When my son was 13, I got a phone call. Dad, I don't want to live with you anymore. I want to sleep at mom's house. This was after his diagnosis, and we'll call him Jack, after Jack's diagnosis of OCD and anxiety. His mother called me and said, Glenn, I would like you, and we'll call her Jill. Jill calls me and says, Glenn, we would like you to allow Jack to sleep here just for maybe 1 or 2 months, 3 months maybe, until he gets his anxiety in order, and then we'll go back to 50-50 parenting. I'm compassionate. I'm caring. I agreed, but I also told my son it's not your decision to make. You're 13 years old. This is a decision your mom and I need to make. So that's number one, that they avoid the relationship. And from there, things just got worse and worse. And I'll explain a bit more about my story a bit later on. Number two, the child has a positive relationship with that parent before they rejected him or her. Yes, we had a great relationship. I took him on trips. We had a lot of fun together. However, what always happened was he had fun in the moment, but afterwards, after he spent some time at his mother's house, at Jill's house, he came back saying, I didn't have fun. Dad's house is no fun. So something happened there. I don't know what it is. I'm just saying. Okay. Three, there is no evidence of abuse, neglect perpetrated by the rejected parent. I did not abuse my child. There was one situation during this whole process after he said, Dad, I don't want to live with you anymore. He wrote me a letter. Allegedly, he wrote the letter about what I did. There was nothing in there that was glaring. There was nothing in what's called a 211 report that was glaring in respect to abuse. And I can assure you and the people who know me that I'm not an abusive individual. I do raise my voice at times. I do like people to be happy, but I'm no abuser. And what happened was I asked him to discuss the letter, and he refused to discuss the letter. He then took my wife's laptop, because I'm remarried, lifted up in the air, threatened to throw it to the ground. So what I did is I had to save that computer because my wife runs her own business. I grabbed the computer from him. I grabbed him. We fell to the ground. I got the computer, but what came back was I hit him. I had an altercation. Part of that story was missing in the 211 report. And the 211 report is a report done by a psychologist to understand each group and what they are saying about the other. And for me, what I noticed were manipulations of the truth. And this was just one example. That laptop was about to hit the ground and it could not because it had vital business information on it. Now, it's interesting that my son learned to resort to picking something up and throwing it, which is a learned behavior. We learn how to handle certain things. And I know where that comes from. Let me continue. The other parent has used multiple parental alienating behaviors. I talked about parental alienating behaviors in my previous episode. I'm going to talk a bit about it today. And the child exhibits behavioral manifestations of parental alienation for sure. The evidence is there that he indeed is being alienated. And I'm going to continue with the article. Here we go. Parental alienating behaviors can include the alienating parent discrediting the target parent by sabotaging, undermining, and manipulating their relationship with the child. After the divorce, my ex and I were very amicable for about 9 years until there was a moment in time where I shared with her that I wanted her to stop calling my son at my house. At the age of 13, she was in constant contact with him, and to let him be with me and to also teach me the skills that she was teaching my son around how to go to bed at night, how to deal with your fears and anxieties. She refused to do that. I then let her know that I always knew that our relationship was not good, and I feared speaking up to her and sharing that. In that moment, in hindsight, what I did was I think I planted the seed of I'm going to take your son away because it wasn't the first time that I was threatened to have my son taken away from me. This happened during the divorce when she announced it. It happened one time when I was late to pick him up. Glenn, I'm going to take your son away. Bye bye. He's now gone. So she won. And if I could turn back the hands of time, I would not have managed that conversation the way I did, because I think that helped plant the seed in respect to alienation. The other thing is that nothing I could do was right. I always heard back from her after visits that, Glenn, what you did was wrong. You should be doing this. I would get asked from her to please make sure your child is safe. Please take care of Jack when he's in your custody. I, I would get calls. Can I speak to Jack? I want to make sure he's okay. So there is this picture painted that I am a terrible parent, that I am unsafe, that my house is unsafe, that the way my wife and I parent our mutual son, Jack, is the wrong way of parenting, and her way of parenting is the right way of parenting. This went on for a while, and I'm going to get more into that. And sorry that this is a longer podcast, but there's a lot of information to explain here, and I hope you have the patience to listen to this. It has been suggested that alienating parents present with paranoid, histrionic, or narcissistic personality traits and have affective disorders, suicidal ideation, and the lack of resilience around separation and loss. They also tend to have dysfunctional histories and poor relationships with their parents. Ooh, what do I share here? That's true. There was um there was dysfunction with her and her family, for sure. I lost a lot of friends because friends who did not align with her priorities, beliefs were canceled. Happened many times, just even around jealousy. She didn't have a father. Her father left her at a young age, so she grew up fatherless. And he just took off, just had her mom. So there were challenges there, but I also need to talk about my family. And I definitely estranged my dad for 3 months. I didn't get along with my father, but then I started talking to my parents, my mom, because my dad's passed away, and there's a history of alienation in my family, but it was more initiated by the father, not the child. And she, Jill, has a situation in her family as well where somebody has alienated their child. So this stuff is known, history repeats itself, and it really aligns with what the National Health Commission is saying just around alienation and to be mindful of history. So my message to you out there is if you're getting married, find out some history, generational history. What might you be up against? Because history does repeat itself, and chances are my son is going to be alienated by his kids. Maybe. Do I want that for him? No, I'd like to have a relationship with him. That's my hope. However, I may never see him again. So ultimately, alienated parents prioritize their own needs over and above their child's needs. And a lot of alienated parents suffer from insecurities. And this is a way of getting control. Somebody loves me. I better control it. If I don't have them in my life, what does it say about me? And they cling on, but they have to have an enemy there, which is unfortunate. So that's why a lot of parental alienation has an underlying personality disorder, such as borderline, narcissism, you name it. But unfortunately, the court system, it's hard to convince the judge of that. And the because of the personality disorder, it's easy for that individual to manipulate the truth and to show a different side of them that people don't necessarily see. They can choose that. And I know that for sure because there was two extremes with Jill in how things were, either super angry or super manipulative and loving. And my child would sometimes come home to my place, Jack, and I would get a call about 5 minutes later from Jill saying, "Can I talk to Jack?" I yelled at him. I said things I shouldn't have said to him. They would be on the phone and she would be crying, would apologize, and then come over and give him a hug. Now, the also, when you hear this, is the abuse tends to stay with the abuser. I was a victim of domestic violence. I was certainly hit. I was belittled. I was the target of many curse words and many threats. I had a lot of fear. I didn't stand up for myself, but I forgot one situation where we're on a major highway in Toronto, Ontario, and I was accused of looking at a woman. And we had our friends in the back of the car, and I get a punch in the face from my ex. I completely forgot about that. But these are the things that can happen. Like there's emotional outbursts. So you can imagine what that child is dealing with. And there could be fear because even he said to me, "Dad, you know how mom is. I'm not going to talk back to her." His mom was also very alone, and I was with somebody else. So I had a whole different dynamic. And I'm not saying that things were perfect in my home. They were far from perfect. We learned a lot of lessons about what not to do. And I made my mistakes and I apologized for all that. Never got anything back. Nothing is wrong with the alienating parent. It's just the targeted parent. That's the problem. In terms of the targeted parents, I love this statement here. Back to this article. Targeted parents can present with a history of passivity, emotional constriction, and overaccommodation of demands made by the ailing parent. Yep, I did that. I had so much compassion, and I still do. But like, it was so funny. My wife said, "You know what? You have some anger to deal with here, and to do this activity around anger." And I tried to do it, and I couldn't get angry at my ex. I couldn't get angry at my son. I processed a lot of that stuff because I have so much compassion. And a rational human being would be willing to work things out with both parents because I was always there for my son. I got a lot of accolades from my ex, Jill, about Glenn, you're doing a great job. Thank you so much. I was always there for her. I always helped her out. So things were great until again, I kind of cut her off as a friend by setting my boundaries. You can do some research on that if you want. In terms of the child, suggest anxious, fearful, or overly passive children may lack the resilience to withstand the alienating process. Psychological consequences for children subjected to parental alienation behaviors are clear, with both negative, immediate, and long-term effects. These include self-esteem issues, anxiety, depression, substance use, increased suicidality. I've never even heard that word. School-related difficulties, and a greater risk of being alienated from their children in the future. I know my son had a lot of fear, and I know where that fear comes from. And there was times we went on trips. He was afraid of even being in a subway. He was afraid of certain things. I know he was taken to the bathroom, even at the age of 12, with his mom, hand in hand, doing these things because I know she has a lot of fear and I get where her fear comes from. And I'm not angry with her about her fear, but when it's used against me and me being an unsafe individual, that's where problems arise. That's what I disagree with in how the other parent, Jill in this case, is made to look all good, and my way of parenting is all bad. Now I'm going to get a bit more into the story. In my situation, and this is my experience, I was in a state of fear. I grew up as a fearful child. I get that. And I have a lot of compassion for people, and I don't speak up when I need to speak up. And that's a challenge for me. And I know that's one reason my son indicated he didn't stay with me is because I didn't stand up for him in front of my wife. And I admit that I did not always stand up for him. And if I could, I would, but I also have to be mindful of agreements that I have with my wife. And ultimately, in good relationships, the husband and wife are partners. But one thing, and the line was crossed, was if you're in a family where you have a child that you inherit and they become your stepchild, one rule is never discipline that child. It's up to the biological parent to discipline the child. And yes, we made mistakes. We had to see a counselor about how to parent my son, but I digress. So I lacked in being an advocate. I was a coward. I am a coward. And what I witnessed was, in her case, strained relations with the family, no relationship with her father, a need to be super loving. And she was, but then she was very jealous, lost a lot of friends, got into rage, physical abuse. She had a lot of fear. We had an alarm system on our house that was on even in the evening, even in the daytime. There's certain extremes that happened. Lack of friends. I had to cancel a lot of my friends out. There was a lot of blame. And this led to eventually she announced a divorce because she met somebody else. In the divorce, and here's where I get into my story. She told me during one of the arguments that I will take everything from you, including your son. She knew how to hurt me. She knew my triggers, and she knew how to push those buttons. I knew her triggers as well. I'm not saying I'm completely innocent here. I'm not. And in my podcast, if you listen to my other episodes, you will hear more about what I've learned, what I've done differently as a result of learning from my experiences. We moved to two separate homes and we were relatively close together as well. We ended up getting 50-50 custody. My son was 4. He had extreme separation anxiety. Drop him off at day camp or school, and he would cry for about 5-10 minutes. Sometimes when Jill dropped Jack off, he would cry for about 5 minutes and then he was fine. But then what was happening was there was this over coddling, like, I don't want to let you go. I love you so much. I'm going to miss you so much. And what goes through a child's mind in those moments? And that's something to really consider. I wonder what a child is thinking about that. We had two different styles at home. My ex, Jill, I know they went to watch movies a lot. They would sit on the couch, snuggle and watch movies. They went for walks. They didn't go any trips other than to see some family. They had fun, apparently, but there was angry bouts and there was a lot of apologizing to my son when he was over for misdeeds that happened at her house. But the big thing was whenever my son didn't like something that I did, he would contact his mom and she would helicopter in to save him. Such as when he was 12, we asked him to take a bus to school. Called mom, she took him to school. So these are the things like I never felt like I had my son there. I felt like I was being monitored. I was under a 24-hour surveillance system that everything was going back. It was like I had a spy in my home sharing things, which made me very unsettled and stressed out. And I didn't know how to be sometimes because it seemed like everything I did went back to his mom and I was reprimanded for it. So I grew up with a lot of fear in this whole situation when we're going through the custody. And we both had 50-50 custody. And actually, things worked out really well for the most part. We had a good relationship. My home was completely different. We went on adventure hikes. We had some business stress going on. I was running my own business. My wife was running her own business. We had certain family dynamics because I had a stepson. So it wasn't just about me and my son. It was about me, my wife, my stepson. I'm a people pleaser. I wanted everybody to get along. My son had a lot of anxiety. I tried to help him the best I could. But like a man, I like to fix things. So I was trying to find solutions. I didn't have a softer approach. I didn't always keep to my boundaries. So I'd set boundaries and didn't follow through. And that's what caused some of the conflict in my relationship with my wife. But my son, he is amazing. He was so much fun. We had laughs together. He was a comedian. He was such a comedian. And we fed off each other. But so he had these great behaviors, but he also had behaviors that were very difficult to manage, like temper tantrums, outbursts. He had huge separation anxiety. When my son was diagnosed, and we always knew something was going on with ADHD and OCD, that's when he told me, I don't want to live with you anymore. And I said to him, you know what? And I already mentioned this is not your decision. It's a decision your mom and I need to make. We made some commitments around him coming back. We had a bit of a schedule that we're going to work on temporarily, but it didn't follow. I didn't get responses at times. I would reach out, not hear anything back. I became very desperate, very desperate. And desperate times call for desperate measures. And I must have looked like I was going nuts. And I was. I didn't know what to do. All of a sudden, I didn't have my son and he was not communicating with me. We had a great relationship before, and that ended. It was so hard for me. And I did a lot of research, talked to a lot of different people. What do I do? I got mixed messages, and my son got mixed messages. And sometimes I would get a text like right before I'm supposed to see him. I don't want to see you. I have homework to do. Excuses after excuses. And silence is deadly. As an alienating, rather, as an targeted parent, we go through a lot of silence. It's so hard. It's like talking to a wall of lies and never being able to break through. There were things that came through where I could tell his mom was writing the text. It wasn't him. This was not 13-year-old language. I knew his writing style. I knew the number of mistakes he made. He didn't make any mistakes in these communications to me. And there was one time where he said, Dad, I'm going to come back and be with you more, but I want to have a Game Boy because my stepson just left to go to another country and he took his Game Boy with him. Sorry, it's not his Game Boy, his Xbox or whatever, PlayStation. So I bought him a PlayStation. He comes over, I show him the PlayStation, and later on he says, You're trying to manipulate me. Like these are things a 13-year-old doesn't say. This adult speak. And it didn't stop there. There were so many other things that happened. I tried to convince him to go to a self-empowerment workshop. And and this was before this all happened as well, that I went through and kids go through and they feel empowered. His mom said no. And I took him to one and I got in a lot of trouble because One thing about people who manipulate other people, you don't want that person to have control. You want to be in control of that person. So there's things that are happening that are clearly an effort to control and keep my son with her, apartment in her house, a dog, these different things. And I hear this kind of stuff on his podcast as well. And it's hurting me because his mom's all good and I'm all bad. There was him needing to be meditated to and with every time he went to bed. So every night she would call when he was 13 and do a meditation with him. And I said, you need to teach me how to do this. I should be able to do this when he's in my custody. And she said, no. Like that took away the control. So I was never trusted to do things with my son. She did universe healing, mathematics healing around predicting the future based on star alignment and mathematics. I completely disagreed with that. She did it. So what she wanted was allowed, and I allowed her to do it. But what I wanted was not allowed and was seen as all bad. Messages of defamation of my character in front of my son and then in front of my wife. Like one time she belittled my wife for being late to pick him up for school by 5 minutes and verbally abused her in front of my son. I was bringing my son after a hockey game to a work event, and I said, we don't have time for a shower. We have to go there right away. And she said in front of my son, you only think about yourself. You don't care about anybody else. This is what I endured. Constant bombardment of you're not good enough. You're not doing the right thing. And it's hard to deal with that. The other thing, so when this alienation happened and we're going through this, there was many situations that unfolded that clearly align with what alienation is all about. One thing is mixed manipulating truths or completely converting a truth to something else, threats. So I was threatened to not go to his hockey game. He sent me a text saying, come to my hockey game again, and I will not see you for a very long time. I was a DJ at the game. I kept the score at the game. I was involved at the game and I listened to him. I stopped going. But there was a threat there and nothing I did was wrong. I just watched his hockey game and I was proud of my son. There was another example that was quite something where he had a concert and he was playing in the concert and he contacted my mom and said, Grandma, do you want to come see me? And she said yes. And then he said, I'd like dad to come too. And wow, that touched my heart that he wanted me to be there. I was about to go and she gets a text saying, I don't want dad to be there. I went anyway. After the concert, he and Jill left and didn't even say a word to us. And then my mother was reprimanded for bringing his father to see him in a concert. These are things that for a child to see this, what's going on? Where is this fear? Like there was one time where he said, Dad, you can only talk to me if you see the counselor we're seeing. So I went to see the counselor. We had a conversation. And then tried to talk to him. I went to his house to talk to him. I knocked on the door, and I've never done anything violent to them ever. And his mother yells at me, say, leave, you're scaring your son, starts screaming. And my son's in the background. She called the police, apparently, called 911. I get a visit from the police. But this is what I mean, like these extremes. And for a child, calling the police on your father must have a huge impact on them. In fact, one day I rode by his house on my motorbike. I tooted my horn to wave hi. I saw him in the window and I get an email. If you come to my house again, I'm going to call the police. Yet the abuse that I've experienced, like one time I was walking to yoga and as I was walking to yoga, I was going through a park and I had to go close to our house because my yoga studio was like by our house, but it's not directly by our house. It's like 300 meters away. And who do I run into? Jill. What does Jill say? Jill says, are you? effing stalking me? Are you effing stalking me? And I'm like, whoa. And I keep on walking and I say no. And I'm just going to yoga. And she still was screaming. I call the police just to notify them. And apparently she called at the same time saying, I'm being stalked. I was accused of being stalked. My son was adamant that I'm stalking them. Made up. There was, gosh, there were so many things that I can share here. I eventually decided I have to go back to court because he's not come to see me. He's not responding to me. And I self-litigated, which was a mistake, but I was worried about losing money as well. I wish I would have fought it more and I didn't. I went to court because we went to see mediators as well, and we had a parenting schedule arranged, but it never followed through. Like she wasn't accountable to what she said she was going to do. And in fact, when he came over, he was maybe over for an hour if I was lucky, or 2 hours. Then he would call his mom, say, pick me up. And in constant communication on the text in terms of what's working, what's not working, what's dad doing, what is he not doing. Like I mentioned, constant monitoring. Agreements were not adhered to. So I went to the court and I said, we need to adhere to an agreement because I was paying child support. I was doing everything that I was supposed to be doing. And I said, this is the situation, Judge. We had the 211 report, which highlighted alienation. I was clear in my affidavit about alienation and my suspect that I suspected it based on the evidence. And he said to me, if the son doesn't want to see you, there's nothing I can do. At the age of 13, the judicial system in Canada, in my point of view, is not on your side. The fact that the family law system and the mental health system in this country don't seem to dialogue. And yet, a child and how they're brought up is going to have a long term impact on so many others. My child's not talking to anybody in my family. Nobody. He's lost half his family based on history because Jill didn't talk to a lot of her family members. So it becomes this codependence between parent and child, and they're there to support each other. Like there's times I heard that he would have to go to her room at night and cuddle because she was afraid. Like he was fitting the role, in my opinion, of a father taking care of her. And for a child to go through that, and for me to experience the threats and lose a child, like there's things we could have done to work this out and figure things out. We were both seeing the same counselor. She was defiant that she will only do what Jack wants. And that's how she showed up at the meeting. Stoic, no emotional expression whatsoever. I couldn't win. I could not win. The judge sided with Jill, and I said, there's nothing I can do anymore. I've done everything I can. I'll leave it up to Jack if he wants to contact me. Yeah, I gave up. A while later, we decided we had to get out of the neighborhood. My parents moved from Ontario. My mom and Jack had a great relationship, and she was hoping to spend more time with him. She's now 80 almost, and it's been 8 years. Uh, we ended up leaving where we lived to move to a place where I can cultivate community and happiness and avoid having to be around her. She was very toxic, and I have a lot of fear about her. Just want to share a few other things before I stop this recording. In terms of vacations, I was not allowed to go on vacation unless I agreed that she would be in touch with my son once every 2 days. Constant control, constant monitoring. I was accused of leaving my son in a forest on a bike all by himself. Never happened. He fell down on his bike, and I said, get up, you'll be fine. He was 12 years old at the time, or 13. He was crying, and Eventually, I started to leave a bit, but I could see him in sight. And she was told I left him in a forest. This is a tactic that people use all the time. If your kid starts crying and they're of a certain age, you're going to leave them and eventually they're going to come after you. You're not abandoning them. But these are the things that an alienating parent uses against the targeted parent to state to the child, your other parent is bad. Look what they did. And then the child starts giving the parent who's alienating stories that align with their thinking, and you cannot win. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's hopeless. I've been trying to get in touch with my son ever since this has happened. I've sent letters, and I've sent letters that maybe I shouldn't have sent. And that was during my emotionally turbulent times. He's received an inheritance from my family, from two family members that died. And we got inheritance from one of them of a substantial amount, but there was no condolences. No, I'm sorry you went through that. Nothing. There is no empathy. He used to be very empathetic, no feeling of guilt. In fact, on his podcast, which I made the mistake of listening to, he refers us to as like a bad word. Nobody cares about him. He's talking about lies on his podcast that we've said. Like these are things that he believes, but are clearly not true. If you're going through this, I'm sorry. It's important to focus on you, do what you can. This is the hardest thing I've ever been through in my life. It impacts me every single day. I've lost my son. I may never see him back again until either maybe he leaves his house, his mother passes away. I don't know. And I hope he does well. He sounds like he's doing well right now. And that's another thing to consider is at least the alienating parent loves them so much that they're not willing to let go and in safe hands. But the impact of losing so many people in your life and not having a parental figure around to provide some balance. There's so many fatherless and motherless kids out there. And if the justice system can work with mental health and alienating parents and alienated and targeted parents like me, I think we can start coming up with some solutions around this. But it's going to take some effort. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some collaboration. I'm open to ideas. I've recently launched an email address, which is thebrainscrub@gmail.com. I encourage you to reach out to me. If you have some ideas around advocacy, what we can do, there are so many people out there that are trying to do the right thing. For whatever reason, it doesn't seem like governments are listening, and it's time to get them to listen. And thankfully, some countries are making progress. Thanks for allowing me to share this. I try to focus on the facts, observable data, and I think it's very important to have compassion about what the other parent has gone through. They're only doing what they know to do, and maybe they don't even know what they're doing. But sadly, there are so many people impacted by that. I have my faults. Jack has his faults. Jill has her faults. We all have our faults. But if we can start treating people like human beings, not like labels or mistruths or us versus them, I think we can do a lot for humankind and this world. Thanks for listening.